I was going to say good morning, but I realized now it's afternoon. So good afternoon. And welcome to our first story studio. I am Craig Manassian, the Chief Content Communications and Marketing Officer for the Clinton Foundation. And on behalf of President Clinton, Hillary Clinton, Chelsea Clinton, and everybody at CGI, I want to thank you for participating in CGI. Some of you have been here before, some of you are new, but you're now all part of a community that over the course of, since we started this in 2005, have made more than 3,700 commitments to action that are helping more than 435 people in 180 countries. So that's all because of you. So thank you so much. For those of you who were here the first iteration of CGI, which we concluded in 2016, you may notice we've done some things differently, and one of which is we're incredibly excited about is this session today called Story Studio. It's the first time we're trying it. As you know, as you hope you know, President Clinton and Secretary Clinton and Chelsea really believe in the power of story. The president often says, if you understand someone's story, you can break down barriers and really come to a common understanding when you get to know them, and that starts with their story. So when we thought about this session, and the Clintons thought about how they wanted to do it and who they would want in it, the very first person they thought of was Dave Isay. Dave, as you know, is the CEO and founder of StoryCorps, probably the foremost storytelling organization in America, an NGO that's incredibly effective. And we're so happy and proud to have him kick off our inaugural Story Studio. So please welcome Dave Isay.
Oh. I have never been too short for a microphone before. It's nice to be here. Thank you so much, Craig. Thank you for giving me the chance to kick off the Story Studio. It's an honor. I hope you don't rue this decision. So I'm gonna talk about StoryCorps today for half an hour and play some stories, answer questions, tell you about a new initiative we have going on around toxic polarization across the United States, all in 30 minutes. So put your seatbelts on. Before we get started, I'm just curious, who here has heard of StoryCorps? Okay. Anybody participated in StoryCorps here? A couple of people I know. Good to see you. And who is wondering who this guy is standing between your, 11, 12 o'clock and your lunch? Okay, two people right there. Okay, good. So let me explain. I'm going to explain what StoryCorps is, play some stories. If you have questions, just raise your hand and I'll repeat the questions. So StoryCorps started 18 years ago here in New York City. I was a radio documentary producer for decades before that, and did a lot of stuff in prisons and housing projects and homeless shelters. And was lucky enough to find my calling when I was really young, when I was a kid. So when I was in a penitentiary in Louisiana at the age of 20, interviewing guys who had served, 50-year sentences, the longest sentences in American history, and talking to them not about their crimes, but about their kids, about their parents, with just a microphone and a tape recorder. When someone who's never been asked these kind of questions is just looked in the eye and told that they matter by listening to them, I saw that it could have a transformative effect on people, and sometimes and always was deeply meaningful to people. So I did documentaries for many decades, loved doing that, and then had this crazy idea to start StoryCorps, which basically takes documentary and turns it on its head. When you do a documentary for film or TV or print, the idea is to interview a few people and then turn that into a work that is seen or heard or read by many, many people. And the idea with StoryCorps is to give everybody in the country the chance to be listened to. So we put a booth in Grand Central Terminal, and the architect of the booth is right here, Michael Schumann, sitting in the front row. We put a booth in Grand Central Terminal where you can bring anyone who you want to honor by listening to their story. A parent, a friend, a grandparent. You come to this booth with your grandmother. You go inside, the door shuts, you're in complete silence. There's a facilitator who works for StoryCorps there with you. And you sit across from your grandfather for 40 minutes and you listen and you ask questions. And I knew from making radio documentaries that the microphone gives you the license to say things, to ask things that you may never have said before or asked before. So people from the very beginning of StoryCorps thought of this as if I had, they're 40-minute sessions. If I had 40 minutes left to live, what would I say to this person who means so much to me? What would I ask of them? At the end of the 40 minutes, you get a copy, and another copy stays with us and goes to the Library of Congress, so your great-great-great-great-great-great-grandkids can get to know your grandmother someday through her voice and story. So a very simple idea. As Michael knows, it started out slowly. When we first opened this booth in Grand Central Terminal, nobody knew what we were doing. There were a lot of empty slots, but eventually it became extremely popular. We launched Airstream trailers that travel across the country recording stories. We've had about 700,000 people participate in StoryCorps so far, largest collection of human voices ever gathered, and essentially because of the nature of what happens in these booths, these very intense conversations, we're kind of collecting the wisdom of humanity. So let's listen to a little bit of that wisdom of humanity. I'm going to start with a story from like the first or second week of StoryCorps in Grand Central Terminal. And this is, so the interviews are 40 minutes, and we create excerpts that you might have heard on NPR every Friday that are 3 minutes long. We've done thousands of those. And then we also create animations. And these stories, I hope, are just little kind of poems with a shelf life of forever that speak to who we really are as Americans, which is not the story, we'll talk about this a little bit later, that you might get on 24-hour news. So this first story is a mom named Sarah Littman and her son, Josh. And Josh actually brought his mom to StoryCorps. These were the days when we had a fairly empty booth. Josh heard about StoryCorps. Josh has Asperger's syndrome, and as many of you know, that's a form of autism where the kids are extremely smart, have very, very serious social problems, often develop obsessions. In New York, many kids with Asperger's develop obsessions with the subway system, learn everything about subways, the lines, the trains. In Josh's case, it's animals. So keep that in mind as we listen. We have, when you come to StoryCorps, my background is as a journalist, so we expect you to prepare, and we have, you know, the best questions that you may want to ask, and hundreds of other questions. Josh is one of the rare people, even among the 700,000, who did not look at the question list, came up with his own questions. So let's just listen to a little excerpt of Josh Littman and his mom at StoryCorps, week 1 or week 2.
From a scale of 1 to 10, do you think your life would be different without animals?
I think it would be an 8 without animals because they add so much pleasure to life.
How else do you think your life would be different without them?
I could do without things like cockroaches and snakes.
Well, I'm okay with snakes as long as they're not venomous or like can constrict you or anything.
Yeah, I'm not a big snake person.
But cockroach is just the insect we love to hate.
Yeah, it really is.
Have you ever thought you couldn't cope with having a child?
I remember when you were a baby, you had really bad colic, so you would just cry and cry. And
What's
I didn't know
colic?
It's when you get this stomach ache and all you do is scream for like 4 hours
Even
a
louder
night.
than Amy does?
You were pretty loud, but Amy's was more high-pitched.
I think it feels like everyone seems to like Amy more, like she's like the perfect little angel.
Well, I can understand why you think that people like Amy more, and I'm not saying it's because of your Asperger's syndrome, but being friendly comes easily to Amy, whereas I think for you it's more difficult. But the
Yeah,
people who
like-
take the time to get to know you love you so much.
Like Ben or Eric or Carlos.
Yeah, and
Like I have better quality friends but less quantity.
I wouldn't judge the quality, but I think
I mean, like, first it was like Amy loved Claudia, then she hated Claudia, she loved
yeah,
Claudia, then
you know
she
what?
hated Claudia.
Part of that's a girl thing, honey. The important thing for you is that you have a few very good friends, and really that's what you need in life.
Did I turn out to be the son you wanted when I was born? Like, did I meet your expectations? And
You've exceeded my expectations, sweetie, because, you know, sure, you have these fantasies of what your child's going to be like, but you have made me grow so much as a parent because you think
well, I was the one who made you a parent.
you were the one who made me a parent. That's a good point. But also because you think differently from, you know, what they tell you in the parenting books.
Yeah.
I really had to learn to think out of the box with you. And it's made me much more creative as a parent and as a person. And I'll always thank you
And that
for
helped
that.
when Amy was born.
And that helped with Amy was born, but you were just so incredibly special to me. And I'm so lucky to have you as my son.
Oh. To Sarah and Josh, yeah. So that was an early indication that StoryCorps was going to work. I know that after this was broadcast on NPR, Josh had a very hard time socially in school. And after this was broadcast on NPR, Sarah and Josh received thousands of letters and emails saying what an amazing kid Josh was. So Sarah put those all into a binder, and when Josh would get beat up at school and come home after a hard day, they would just go through the binder and page by page read through loving emails to him. Okay, we're going to do another parent-kid interview. We've expanded. We're going to Jackson, Mississippi. I'm going to play one or two stories from Jackson, which always deserves our love, but they're going through a very terrible water crisis right now, and especially deserve our love. This is, as you see, Albert and Aiden Sykes. Aiden is, I think he's 10 years old. And this is just an excerpt. Again, they're 40-minute interviews, an excerpt of what happened in an Airstream trailer that was pulled up in Jackson, Mississippi when Albert and Aiden came together. So let's listen.
Do you remember what was going through your head when you first saw me?
I remember when the doctor pulled you out, the first thing I thought was that he was being too rough with you. And he actually held you like a little Sprite bottle, and he was like, "Here's your baby." That was the most proud moment of my life. Don't tell your brothers, because it's three of y'all. But it was like looking at a blank canvas and just imagining what you want the painting to look like at the end, but also knowing you can't control the paint strokes. The fear was just, I got to bring up a black boy in Mississippi, which is a tough place to bring up kids, period. But there are statistics that say black boys born after the year 2002 have a 1 in 3 chance of going to prison. And all three of my sons were born after the year 2002.
So, Dad, why do you take me to protest so much?
I think I take you for a bunch of reasons. One is that I want you to see what it looks like when people come together, but also that you understand that it's not just about people that are familiar to you, but it's about everybody. Did you know the work that Martin Luther King was doing was for everybody and it wasn't just for black people?
Yes, I understand that.
Yeah. So that's how you got to think. If you decide that you want to be a cab driver, then you got to be the most impactful cab driver that you can possibly be.
Are you proud of me?
Of course. You my man. I just love everything about you, period.
The thing I love about you never give up on me. That's one of the things I will always remember about my dad.
You said it like I'm on the way out of here or like I'm already gone.
So, Dad, what are your dreams for me?
My dream is for you to live out your dreams. It's an old proverb that talks about when children are born, children come out with their fists closed because that's where they keep all their gifts. And as you grow, your hands learn to unfold because you're learning to release your gifts to the world. And so for the rest of your life, I want to see you live with your hands unfolded.
So I think of these stories as, well, first of all, there's so much to learn from these stories. I mean, people kind of have called this kind of the Wikipedia of wisdom. It's really the collective wisdom that we pass from one generation to the next. And in many ways, StoryCorps is the opposite of reality TV. Nobody comes to get rich. Nobody comes to get famous. It's an act of generosity and love, which is, I think I know that people always talk about StoryCorps, like these stories we've heard are not sad, and StoryCorps stories often make people cry. And I think that the reason is that we're surrounded by so much phoniness and nonsense that when you hear just people like talking to each other because they love each other and being completely authentic, you're kind of walking on holy ground. And that's what makes people really emotional when they hear StoryCorps stories. That said, I am going to play a hard story for you guys now, if that's okay. This is a story that's been on my mind a lot lately. And it's about political leadership and courage and the immigrant experience. I know that President Clinton was just talking to President Zelensky, and his name comes to mind as well. This is a story about the assassination of Bobby Kennedy. In many ways, StoryCorps is all everyday people. And one of the incredibly valuable things about StoryCorps is leaving a record for your kids. I interviewed my dad many years ago, and he died a couple years later very suddenly. He was working and was diagnosed with cancer, and 3 days later he was dead. And I listened to that interview at 3 a.m. on the night that he passed. And I'm an old dad, I have young kids, and I knew this was the way that my kids were going to get to know this person who was such a huge figure in my life. And that's really when the rubber hits the road. But there's also a historical element to StoryCorps, bottom-up history of this country through our stories and our voices. And this story speaks to that. This is a man named Juan Romero who came to StoryCorps shortly before the 50th anniversary of Bobby Kennedy's assassination. In a famous photograph taken seconds after Senator Kennedy was shot, he is pictured holding Senator Kennedy's head. He was a busboy at the hotel in Los Angeles where Senator Kennedy was shot. And at StoryCorps, shortly before the 50th anniversary, Juan Romero came with his wife to remember how he met Senator Kennedy the night before when he delivered food to his room. And Mr. Romero was an undocumented immigrant at the time. So let's listen.
They opened the door, and the senator was talking on the phone. He put down the phone and says, "Come on in, boys." You could tell when he was looking at you that he's not looking through you, he's taking you into account. And I remember walking out of there like I was 10 feet tall. The next day, he had his victory speech. So they came down the service elevator, which is behind the kitchen. I remember extending my hand as far as I could, and then I remember him shaking my hand, and as he let go, somebody shot him. I kneeled onto him and put my hand between the cold concrete and his head just to make him comfortable. I could see his lips moving, so I put my ear next to his lips, and I heard him say, "Is everybody okay?" I said, "Yes, everybody's okay." I could feel a steady stream of blood coming through my fingers. I had a rosary in my shirt pocket, and I took it out, thinking that he would need it a lot more than me. I wrapped it around his right hand, and then they wheeled him away. The next day, I decided to go to school. I didn't want to think about it. But this woman was reading the newspaper, and you can see my picture in there with the senator on the floor. She turned around and showed me the picture and says, "This is you, isn't it?" And I remember looking at my hands, and there was dry blood in between my nails. Then I received bags of letters addressed to a busboy. There was a couple of angry letters. One of them even went as far as to say that if he hadn't stopped to shake your hand, the senator would have been alive. So I should be ashamed of myself for being so selfish. It's been long 50 years, and I still get emotional. Tears come out. But I went to visit his grave in 2010. I felt like I needed to ask Kennedy to forgive me for not being able to stop those bullets from harming him. And I felt like, it would be a sign of respect to buy a suit. I never owned a suit in my life. And so when I wore the suit and I stood in front of his grave, I felt a little bit like the first day that I met him. I felt important, I felt American, and I felt good.
Among many other things, Mr. Romero's story is a reminder of the fierce urgency of recording. He died about 2 weeks after he recorded this story. And I want to read an excerpt of an email that we received right after he passed away. It says, I just heard the news about Juan Romero. Now remember, he recorded this just a couple days before the 50th anniversary of Bobby Kennedy's death. The email says, on the 50th anniversary of Bobby Kennedy's death, I took the subway to Arlington Cemetery to pay my respects. I made it just before the gates closed. At RFK's grave, I sat down next to an older Hispanic man on the wall opposite. I asked why he was here. I'm here to pay respects to an old friend, he said. I was the one holding his head when he died. I remember that his eyes were wet with tears. He still had his suitcase from the airport. He had flown over for the anniversary and, like me, had made it just in time. As he left, he shook my hand and said, it's good to know that he's still remembered. I just thought you might like to know that Mr. Romero got to say goodbye one last time. Do you want a funny story? Okay. All right. So something a little bit lighter, and then we're going to go. Talk about an issue that has been very much on the mind of everybody at StoryCorps. The toxic polarization inside the country across the political divides. But before that, CGI is a hub for innovation. And to lighten things up a little bit, a story about innovation circa 1935. This is 95-year-old Betty Jenkins, who came to StoryCorps with her niece in Ohio. And she wanted to tell a story about a newfangled, innovative contraption she had received from her mother 70 years before, an inflatable bra.
I was very skinny, and I didn't have any curves. I guess my mother got kind of worried because she didn't think I had enough boyfriends. So she bought me a bra that you blow up. I was real excited, so I blew and blew to about 32. I was quite happy with the looks. I got a few wolf whistles. Of course, at that age, you're very self-conscious. That year, I took a trip to South America. I proceeded to fly to Santiago. Soon we were into the Andes Mountains, and it turned out that it was a non-pressurized plane. And I felt very uncomfortable. Things were getting very tight. This bra had started to increase in size. As the thing got bigger, I tried to stand up and I couldn't see my feet. The directions said it would go to 48 if I wanted to. I thought, what will happen if it goes beyond 48? And I found out what happened. It blew out. It was a loud, resounding sound, and the co-pilot came into the cabin with the gun, wondering what had happened. The men all pointed to me. Well, it's difficult to explain to people in English that part of your anatomy just blew up. But to try and do it in Spanish, it's beyond hope. So they made a landing. I was taken off the plane and turned over to 2 women police, and they told me to strip, hunting for what they thought was the bomb. When I stripped down, I showed them the hole in the bra, and they chuckled. And I thought, oh my, they've gotten the point. And I was allowed back on the plane. A month later, I got a bill from the airline for $400 for an unscheduled stop.
I have so many other stories I want to share with you, but we're running tight on time. So I do want to take a couple questions. I'm going to talk very briefly about what we're up to at StoryCorps now, aside from the big signature StoryCorps, where we continue to, recognize the beauty and the poetry and the power and the grace in the stories of everyday people all around us, hiding in plain sight if we just take the time to listen. It's a little bit corny to say, but we're a nonprofit in the human connection business. And the organization became very concerned 5 or 6 years ago with what is happening and has since escalated greatly in the country. The toxic polarization, the fact that not that we argue across the political divides, but that more and more we are dehumanizing people across the divides. We hate them. We want them dead. You've seen the statistics. In the last summer, there's polling that's come out in the last month that 50% of the country thinks that we're going to see a civil war within our lifetime. 50% of the country thinks that the greatest threat to our country comes from our fellow countrymen, not from our traditional international adversaries. About 20% of Republicans and 15% of Democrats say that the country would be better off if the other party was just wiped off the face of the earth. This is really bad news for the country. A democracy cannot survive in a swamp of mutual contempt. As I said, the numbers are just kind of going through the roof. I don't have to tell you why, we're all witnessing it. But a democracy can't survive in a swamp of mutual contempt. We have had the privilege of having a front row seat on who we are as Americans, and it has been devastating and agonizing to watch what's happened in the country. And our Hippocratic oath is to do no harm to people. And we took 5 years creating a new way of doing StoryCorps, which we ended up naming One Small Step. Up until now, all of the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people who've participated in StoryCorps have been grandparents and grandkids, people who know and love each other. And we created a new method of doing StoryCorps, putting strangers together from across the political divide, not to talk about politics, but just to get to know each other as human beings, under the premise that it's hard to hate up close. We've studied the hell out of this thing because it's so important that we get this right, and we have a methodology that really works. We are in a bunch of cities around the country, continuing to recording thousands of these. It's kind of extraordinary to see what happens. It almost belies belief, but these are Trump supporters and Biden supporters who come together for a conversation, not about politics, and every single one, except for a very, very few, ends the same way, with people saying, I want your phone number, let's have dinner, let's have lunch, let's take a walk together. And it's based on contact theory, which is a theory developed by a psychologist named Gordon Allport in the 1950s, that says that under very specific circumstances, if you put people who hate each other together one-on-one, and they have a visceral experience with each other, again, under very specific conditions, they can come out of that conversation seeing each other very differently. If you do it wrong, you can make things much worse. But if you do it right, you can see like really extraordinary results, and that is what we're seeing. So we are working very, very hard to scale this as quickly as we can. We have a ground game, which is doing as many of these interviews as we humanly can, and an air game where we're sharing the content of these interviews which I don't have time to show you today, unfortunately, to socially norm the idea that it's okay to talk to someone and see someone across the political divides as human. One of the lessons of StoryCorps, we have facilitators who are present for all those interviews, the hundreds of thousands of interviews. And when they come up, we've had probably north of 1,000 facilitators who serve a tour of duty. They're the core of StoryCorps, who serve a tour of duty, bearing witness for a couple of years across the country to these stories. And when you ask them what they've learned to a person, everyone, when they come off the road, gives a version of the Anne Frank quote that people are basically good. So our dream is to convince the country that it's our patriotic duty to see the humanity in people across the divides who we disagree with. We know this is the moonshot of all moonshots, but we are going to fight like hell leading up to 2024 and beyond to see if we can make a dent in this, what they call effectively polarized, increasingly effectively polarized country that we're in, because it's worth fighting for, as you all know, or you wouldn't be here for the at the initiative. So I have time for maybe one or two questions, and I'm going to play a final, very, very quick story, and let you go off to lunch. Yes. Okay. So the question is, where have we been able to facilitate conversations in the Middle East? We have not. So we are a domestic-only project. We're a nonprofit. We have, I see someone who was here at the very beginning of StoryCorps, when in the first year, as many small nonprofits, we came within moments of having to close down and not succeed. And Stan Schumann, who's a donor here at CGI, came in and saved us and allowed us to thrive and become much bigger. We feel like it's irresponsible at this point to expand overseas. We're not strong enough to do that. Someday we will. Obviously, this is it's a project just about humans, and it would work anywhere, but we're completely focused on the U.S. for now, and we probably will be for the next 5 to 10 years. Thank you for the good question, and I see the time is running out, so Stan? So the question was, do you have to release it to the public? So StoryCorps is in every way a public service. And when you do an interview, at the end of the interview, you can sign a release or not sign a release. If you sign the release, it goes to the Library of Congress, and we can broadcast it on the air. If you don't sign the release, you get a copy of the interview. You can put it in a safe somewhere. You've had a chance to connect with a loved one in this really profound way. We don't care. It's whatever you want. Now, when StoryCorps started, I thought because of the intimacy and like from the very beginning, even though it was empty at the beginning, there were very deep conversations happening in the booth. And I thought that we would see, 70% compliance rate with signing the release. And 700,000 interviews later, it's 99.99%. Everybody wants to leave this record for the future. Everyone wants to know. I mean, what StoryCorps reminds us is that, that we matter and we won't be forgotten. And that's all any of us wants to know. So everybody wants to be heard, which is, a big, part of the reason why this polarization in the country has exploded the way that it has. People just want to be heard. They want to be treated with respect. And when you sit down and you look someone in the eye and you ask them who they are, what they care about, who their children are, it's magical. And again, our goal with One Small Step is to try and make a dent in toxic polarization. And with StoryCorps as a whole, it's to weave the ethos of StoryCorps into the fabric of life in America and into the lives of all Americans. And we're going to be fighting this fight for a long time. I have 0 time left, so I'm just going to leave with one word. I was in San Francisco last week, and I had a chance to meet a participant at an event, and he had participated in, we have different segments of StoryCorps, which we call initiatives. So our first one was with 9/11 families. Everyone who lost a loved one on September 11th comes to StoryCorps to leave a record of their life. An African-American initiative, the largest collection of African-American voices ever gathered, and a military voices initiative with people who fought in post 9/11 conflicts in their families. And this was a guy named Zach, Scott Skiles, who had come with his son to StoryCorps as part of the Military Voices Initiative. And they talked about what happened to Zach in Iraq. He served 3 tours of duty. He came back broken, ended up homeless. It was the first time, this happens all the time in a StoryCorps booth. They had never talked about what Zach had seen in Iraq. And it's a beautiful story. I wish I could play it for you. I don't have time. But I saw, a couple of years ago, I met Zach for the first time and played his story. And Scott, the dad, handed me a piece of paper afterwards, and he said, this piece of paper this quote has really sustained me through these really hard times. And I read the quote. It was from a theologian I'd never heard of named Frederick Buechner, who actually died a couple of weeks ago, but very simple. It said, here's the world, beautiful and terrible things will happen. Don't be afraid. So that is my wish for you during these very, very, very difficult times that we're in. Beautiful and terrible things will happen, but you've got to keep fighting the fight, and please don't be afraid. Thank you for... Thank you to Craig and the Clintons for letting me christen StoryCorps Studios. Here's to many wonderful stories and hearts opened in the years ahead at future CGIs. Thank you so much. Thanks for coming.